I always knew there was something different about me, but I could never figure out what it was, so I was very unhappy. Then I discovered I was gay, and I began to like myself. Then from somewhere deep inside, I heard the calling to be a nun. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Growing up in a small farming community in the Midwest, it seemed to me, well, everyone around me had a way of doing things that was right for them. And there's nothing particularly wrong with the way they did things, but I found that I've always been of an artistic and spiritual bent, and so my differences were inherent. The first thing I found I needed to learn in order to survive in such a place is that it's okay to be different. There was nothing in my environment that would tell me that. It still seems somewhat amazing to me, however, that it took me until I was 26 to figure out that I was gay. But I think that it's understandable in that the small town in which I grew up, there was no recognition of that kind of difference. I knew from the time I was 4 and 5 that I was different, but I didn't know what it was, because being gay was such an unspoken thing. It was just like a vacuum of knowledge where an understanding might have been. It seems all the more amusing to me, I guess, that after high school I was in an acting school in New York City for a year, and even living in New York City for a year I didn't figure it out. But I think that's because a lot of it was that I was beginning my journey back to myself. Growing up in an environment in the Midwest, or most places, it's just different in different places, but society teaches you how to be and what to think, and presents a role model for you, whether it's the right one for you or not. Letting someone else pick the model or the form of your life, I suppose, isn't really bad, but it might be akin to having a distant aunt order you a pair of shoes out of a catalog, not knowing what size you wear. There's a lot of fine-tuning that has to be done as you grow up. Well, first I had to understand that I was different, and that it was okay for me to be different, that it wasn't bad or wrong, or that I wasn't somehow bad for being different. Well, I went to New York City, and I began the journey back to myself, because it was an environment so radically different from the small town in which I grew up that I really had to start thinking things through for myself. And in that it was an acting school, I had to get back in touch with my emotions. The particular ethnicity I grew up around tends to be an emotionally unexpressive one. Being an artistic person and being in an acting school, emotions were something that I had to learn how to be expressive about, not something that I could hold in the way that was modeled for me growing up. Well, it was kind of a winding way, I guess, and there's other chapters in between that we can talk about later. But when I finally figured out I was gay, because of the very prominent role that spirituality has always played in my life, it was very important to me. I mean, I could not allow myself to be gay unless I could believe that it was also okay with God that I was gay, that it was somehow a good thing for me to be gay. And I suppose the churches of various denominations will go on debating that one for quite a long time to come yet. To my way of reasoning, one of the first things I learned going to Catholic school was that God was all-powerful. And thus it was easier for me to believe that God intended there to be gay and lesbian people on earth, and that it was we who didn't understand how it was all supposed to fit together. It was easier to believe that than to believe that somehow God had mysteriously lost control during the moment that I was being born. So I don't know that I want to say God allowed it. That sounds rather patronizing and demeaning, as if, God allows someone to come into the earth, come into the world. I know there are denominations within Christianity that say there's certain people are predestined for hell. I, forgive me, don't agree with that. Because I don't know how any person could live within that belief. I think when you choose beliefs, you need to choose the ones that will empower your life and allow you to have some hope, to believe in love, to believe in the possibility of a God who is good. Well, in putting all of those things together, to me it added up to God made me gay, and He intended for me to make my being gay something that was very, very good. Not something that needed to be hidden or repressed or held back until it comes out in some strangely contorted form, but something, just another way of being a person that had as much potential to be good as any other way of being a person. To look at creation, well, in looking at and trying to understand my own life as well, I find certain patterns tend to run through a lot of things. And as you look at the world, there are so many, thousands of species of insects, of every kind of animal. The diversity almost goes off the scale of comprehension. Why then should humanity be any more limited? And in that sense, every person ever born has a chance of further expanding the range that humanity can cover. So I needed to learn that different was okay, that the different that I was okay, that somehow God was in that too. I just needed to begin a quest to learn to understand how, and to understand where we can go with this. People have been debating theology for 2,000 years. I don't think there's anything we're going to solve in an entire TV series. Ultimately, though, you have to make the choices that you're content to live with. And the choice that I could live with, having such a strong sense of spirituality, was that God made me gay, and that being gay in and of itself was neither good nor bad. It was simply a different way of seeing and a different way of being. It was up to me to make it something good, to make it something that would bring beauty and harmony to creation, instead of violence and disconnection and dissension and deception. It's interesting when I first had to describe my discovery of my gayness to my parents, one of the things I told them is that it seemed to me I was embarking on an adventure in honesty, that every day would be a challenge to me to be honest with people about who and what I was not, and not to let them think what they want for the sake of social supposed peacefulness. One of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not bear false witness. And growing up Catholic, I had that one drilled into me early, and so honesty was very important to me. I couldn't pretend this is probably going to sound really strange, seeing me sitting here in costume looking so different. But I find that I'm not able to lead a double life. I am who I am wherever I am. And Sister Who is a part of me with a very different appearance, but the essence is the same. And whether in or out of costume, I need to be honest. I need to present things honestly. I need to speak from the heart. So, as Sister Who, I don't try to live up to anyone's expectations, nor do I try to step on toes. I simply try to be true to the light of God that I find within myself. You know, Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you, and I really believe that that is the most authoritative divine voice, if you will, that anyone needs to listen to. Ministers and books and churches and organizations and all sorts of people and things may present different things for us to think about. But we need to take responsibility for our own choices and our own beliefs and for the implications of those choices and beliefs. If I choose to believe in, a hierarchical situation, something that allows for any human life to be devalued, one of the implications of that is that I will not have that person's best contribution. In order for creation, including humanity, to be the most beautiful that it can be, I need to make a choice that will empower every single part of creation. Something perhaps different from common current consumer attitudes, that we use something, we use it up, we throw it into the garbage dump. There's a lot more talk about recycling these days because we're understanding that we need to bring everything into harmony, that it's not use it up and throw it away, but understanding that each piece of paper, each piece of glass, each piece of metal has some value, and to make everything be its most beautiful, to make everything be its most healthy, to make everything at its best, you need to look for everything's best place in things. It seems to me, if you can recycle a can, it's better to take it to the recycling center than to let it rust in the ground, where, or any other number of things that can be recycled, but that if buried might contaminate groundwater. Everything's interconnected. And, well, one way they put it in the Bible was the verse where it says, be sure your evil deeds will find you out. I suppose you could say, be sure that if you poison the earth will give you something poisoned back. If you put poison into the earth, it's going to come back in the groundwater or some other, or in your food or some other way. When we interact with each other, it's equally as important that we put good things into each other. That when we feel most discouraged and least able to give something good, we give something good to another person because we want to receive something good from that person. But we don't know necessarily when or what that thing will be. But we do know that we want every person and every field and everything around us to have the potential to give us something good. If we put something bad in a person or in a field, or if we don't build a house as well as we could, no matter what the thing is, you put some, it's like the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. It goes for people, and it goes for the earth too. Everything's interconnected. This is an Afghan I've been working on for a little while here, and I guess I like doing Afghans. It's something I've done enough that I don't have to think about too much, but there's a lot of wonderful metaphors there too. And the way I choose to do Afghans when I pick the colors, I like to pick varied colors because life is a lot of varied situations, but there's also a lot of cycles in life, and the same color as you go across begins to repeat every so often. Not always in an exactly predictable way, but in somewhat the general area where you might be able to expect it. Well, as I shift from one color to the next, I always try to make sure that something carries over. In this case, both colors have an element of purple. The next one after this is another color yet, but it has an element of pink in it. And so in that way, one area kind of blends into the next, and kind of blends into the next, and into the next, and right on down the line. My full name is Sister Who Does She Think She Is? And identity is another one of those things that it's got some sort of pattern to it, but not entirely predictable. It kind of goes in cycles, but it kind of wanders a little. But it also starts in one place and evolves to another, and everything it touches has an effect upon it. When I finish this project, the order of the colors is going to make things appear darker and lighter and so forth. To put two things next to each other that have extreme contrast makes the light appear lighter and the dark appear darker. To put things together so that the colors blend creates a sense of interconnectedness, even as there's a marked difference between a dark and light phase. One of the things, especially for people who discover they're gay when they're teenage years, is this question of, well, maybe it's just a phase. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. But getting back to the question of identity, there's always something that we get from those who've gone before us, from our parents and grandparents, from those older than us that we associate with, teachers and people in the community. And there's always something we add to that, some way that we build upon whatever was there before. And then there's always something that we leave for whoever follows after. If the pink and purple in this particular Afghan were the present, and the darker green and purple and red were the past, the present has received purple from the past, and it leaves pink to the future. And in within the present is the color of white. In the same way, what's present, in many ways, is often what we can see the most clearly, what is in the brightest light. Where we're going to, we're not quite sure what the combination is yet, and where we've been begins to fade into darkness, except for those areas that are really special memories that we hold more dearly and that we do remember and that do stand out. Looking back at my college years, there are certain things I remember, and I suppose you could say compassionately, the worst memories, the more painful things, the less pleasant things, my mind allows me to forget more quickly. And yet, in some sense, they're always with us. They're still there at the core of the Afghan. When I make my Afghans, I start from the center and I work toward the outside, always going around and around and around like a snail shell. One of my favorite snail shells that I have at home, I even made a clock out of one once, is a nautilus shell. And the nautilus is a curious sort of animal because as it's building the shell, it keeps building a wall behind it, always walling off whatever chamber was behind it. So that if you cut a nautilus shell in half, you'll actually see all these walled chambers going in toward the center where the nautilus actually began the construction of its house. Well, wherever we've been is still there at the center. It's always with us. It's not something to repress. It's not something to say it's not real anymore. It is real and it's there. But we need to, perhaps this sounds strange, interact with it. We need to have a relationship with the past so that it benefits the present, so that it doesn't become a hollow emptiness behind us, but so that it becomes something supportive in the same way that the nautilus uses the spaces behind it in the shell as something against which to build this wall. It kind of becomes an air pocket of sorts, something in which the wall is suspended. Not something that denies the existence of what's behind it so much as recognizing that what's past is past. It still has a bearing on the present, but it is past at the same time. There's an oft-quoted statement that those who do not know the mistakes of the past are destined to repeat them in the future. I think we need to remember the past. We need to remember the mistakes that have been made. We need to not be dishonest with ourselves about their existence. But nor do we want to stay within them. As the nautilus grows, it needs to move on to successively larger chambers. It cannot occupy the chambers of the past without severing itself from a part of itself. It would be like trying to put on some shoes that I wore when I was a child. I'd have to cut off all my toes and half my foot in order to get my foot inside of it. And of course the consequences of that would be that I would never be able to walk right again. We need to embrace the growth, we need to embrace the change, and sometimes the change brings new vulnerabilities and sometimes it brings new strengths. But in the combination of vulnerabilities and strengths, what it brings is wholeness. And that's what we need to reach for. If we wall off bits of our past and don't acknowledge that that's part of who we are, that we still carry around that mass, even as the nautilus continues to carry around the mass of the old chambers that it no longer occupies. It's like we're off balance. It's like it's harder to understand people who are still possibly in similar circumstances. I once tried to, when I was in college, tried to get down, after all the arguing over what sin is and what's good and all that, I tried to get down to saying, well, what makes sin sinful? What is it that makes sin what it is? And occasionally I would ask different people. I had one guy who told me that he was an atheist. And I said, well, how do you distinguish what's right and wrong? And he answered that he knew something was wrong if it was something that he had been through and it hurt, and it didn't have a constructive purpose. That he knew was wrong. And I thought that was a very workable, very profound definition. That someone could even proclaim to be an atheist and still, be a person with ethics and morals and, not need to be lectured on those things. And it seems to me there's very little that really inherently, in and of itself, is good or bad. Everything depends on a perspective. Having said that, though, it leaves us created in God's image with choices to make, to decide that, okay, fine, it's neither good nor bad, so what am I going to do with it? What do I prefer? How do I want to put my thumbprint upon creation, upon the things that I work with? What is it about what I make that is going to say something about who and what I am? I mean, there's something about this Afghan I'm working on that I would guess certain people who know me well can look at it and be able to tell you who made it, just from knowing the sorts of things I like and the way I do things. In the same way, like any other artist, I think God put a lot of himself into his creation. I mean, I don't put my lifeblood into my Afghans, but there is an expression of me, expression of my spirit, of my likes and dislikes, all kinds of things about me, a sense of me that is within the things I make. And there's a sense of God, I think, in all the things that he has made. I was once invited to go to a pagan Beltane ceremony, and I had a great time. And it really didn't bother me to think of God as a woman within that context, because the leader that night kept referring to the goddess. And I had no problem with that, because even in Catholic school, the understanding I grew up with is that God is something that encompasses maleness and femaleness, but also transcends it. That God's personhood is more than all the things the human word personhood encompasses. It's a transcendent reality, something beyond our words and definitions. And so when I went there that night, the leader said goddess, and talked about spirits of the north and spirits of the east and spirits of the west. And in my mind I thought, I choose to honor God as He is revealed in symbolisms associated with the direction of north. I choose to honor God in the way that He, she, it, the Almighty Thou, is revealed in symbolisms that are frequently associated with the directions of west or south or east. You know, it doesn't become a problem to me to think of God in creation or in nature. Sometimes people want to make a distinction about, well, are you worshiping the creation, or are you worshiping the Creator behind the creation, or are you... I think the lines are sufficiently fine that we don't need to argue about them. It's kind of like, some of my pagan friends believe in a number of gods and goddesses instead of a single one. But then they're quick to add that there is a sense of unity and agreement and a way in which all the gods and goddesses work together. And on the other hand, I know there are religions in the world that think of one God who has as many as 99 faces and hundreds of names. Well, what really is the difference between having one God with many faces and many names, or having many gods with a spirit of unity? I mean, it's kind of like the chicken and egg question. The two go so hand in hand that I don't know why we need to argue about it. Ultimately, people need to believe in what is most helpful to them. Perhaps, I'll say hypothetical, but it's not because it doesn't really happen. You know, in approaching God, if God is defined as specifically, perhaps exclusively masculine, how are you going to get a young girl who was the victim of incest to have positive feelings about God, since her father did some very evil things? You know, perhaps there are all sorts of reasonable explanations, but it doesn't change the fact that some very evil things were done to her. And if she is expected to see God as a father, it's going to be a real problem. You know, perhaps for someone like that, it would be more compassionate to let her see God as mother, or as genderless person, or whatever is helpful. The important thing to me, it seems, is not that she see God as father, but that she have a relationship with a person who is the embodiment of divine love. Speaking of embodiment, as I read the New Testament, it describes, in the Bible, it describes at the end of Jesus' time on earth, in the Catholic Church, I think they call it the Feast of the Ascension, where 40 days after rising from the dead, Jesus was bodily taken up into heaven. Well, that and another thing that I read, I'm afraid I can't remember where, while I was in college, about people in Germany cleaning up the rubble after, I think it was Germany, after World War II, and discovering a statue of Jesus Christ that had fallen over and the hands had broken off. And they considered what to do for a while and then decided to leave it. And I'm sorry, I'm getting the single. We've run out of time here. I have to continue this one in the next show. Thank you much for tuning in.